Okay, this is revision session number 1, section 2 of the year 10 unit. It's the Treaty of Versailles to begin with. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to cover is the aims of the big three at the Treaty of Versailles. The big three were George Clemenceau, David Lloyd George, Woodrow Wilson. Where possible, I'm going to go through these in a kind of DEA format as well. Okay, so first of all, describing what Clemenceau wanted. He wanted to gain security for France by preventing another attack on its frontiers. He wanted to disarm the Germans and weaken the German army. He wanted to regain Alsace and Lorraine. And he wanted to make Germany pay the cost of the damage caused by World War I. And he simply wanted revenge for the French people. As I've said, don't worry if you can't keep up with these as I'm going through. They will be on YouTube for you to recap. It's better if you do recap. I won't stop for long between the points that I'm making, simply because if I did, we'd be here a lot longer than 20 minutes. So I'm going to go at a fair pace. Write down what you can. Be as quick as you can. Try and use shorthand. And then go back to it on YouTube when it's up online, okay? So, explaining why Clemenceau wanted this. He wanted security because Germany had invaded France twice in his own lifetime, 1870 and 1914. Most of World War I had been fought on French soil as far as the French were concerned. Civilians and military had been killed. Industry and agriculture had been destroyed. So he simply wanted revenge. In an economic sense, he wanted France to recover, the French economy to recover from World War I. And their biggest threat was their neighbour Germany. So limiting the power of the German military was a good way of securing French safety. He was also under a lot of pressure from the French public. Remember, he's an elected official. And the final point, the final explanation for his aims would be he wanted compensation. The French people wanted compensation for the damage caused by World War I. Okay, analysis. Did he get what he wanted? Yes, to a degree. In the short term, he gained security for France. The German army was limited to 100,000 soldiers. The navy was limited to 15,000 men. No tanks or aircraft were allowed. No troops were allowed within 50 kilometres of the River Rhine, a demilitarised zone, this kind of buffer zone. This weakened the German army and prevented the chance of another attack in the short term. Of course, we know the long term, it sort of sowed the seeds for the rise of Hitler, and 20 years later, France was invaded again. Was he successful? Yes, he regained Alsace and Lorraine. So there's another point of success for the French. He was helped in no small part by Woodrow Wilson's idea of self-determination there, if you want to include that point. And he was also successful in making Germany pay. As we know, they had to pay the £6.6 billion in reparations. The only sort of mitigating factor that we can discuss really is that in the long term, 20 years later, the German economy recovered, the military recovered, and French security wasn't all it was cracked up to be. Partially because of the harshness of the Treaty of Versailles. Next of the big three is David Lloyd George. What were David Lloyd George's aims? People have argued that David Lloyd George was the kind of compromise view, that he was balanced, he was more balanced he was kind of stuck in the middle between Clemenceau on the one hand, wanting to really punish Germany, and Woodrow Wilson on the other hand, being what the French would describe as far too lenient. He wanted Germany to be punished. He saw them as responsible for the war, so he did want them to be punished, but not too harshly. He wanted Germany to remain economically viable as a trading partner. So he had the future in mind. He didn't want Germany to be punished too harshly, or they wouldn't be able to trade with Britain down the line. He did want Germany to pay for the cost of the war. He did want compensation. And he did want to keep the supremacy of the British Navy. So he was all for some kind of military restrictions being imposed. Okay, E, explain, why did he want this? He didn't want Germany to be punished too hardly because a couple of reasons. The first one I've already mentioned. He wanted Germany to recover fairly quickly so they would be a trading partner. He also feared the spread of communism. If you damage a country too much economically, then the threat of extremism is increased and the country is more likely to turn to communism. And the British feared this. They'd seen it happen in Russia only just over 12 months earlier. He also wanted Germany to be punished because there was an election coming up. Again, he's an elected official, Prime Minister. So he had his eye on what the British public wanted, and the British public wanted Germany to be punished harshly. He wanted the supremacy of the British Navy for obvious reasons. He wanted the Empire to be protected, and the British Navy the Royal Navy was an important part of that. Financially, he also needed compensation because they owed the USA £1 billion. So they wanted Germany to pay for the cost of the war that would allow them to pay back the money they owed to the USA. Okay, analysis then. Was he successful? Yes. He secured the supremacy of the British Navy. As we know, limited to 15,000 men, 6 battleships, no submarines, no tanks, no aeroplanes. He was successful in getting the Germans to pay reparations, as we know, £6.6 billion. Reasons he perhaps wasn't successful, however, you could argue that Germany was punished too harshly. They were so badly affected by loss of land and the reparations costs that their economy suffered too much and they weren't a viable trading partner. It was also touch and go whether Germany would turn communist as well. So it was on the line, on the edge of turning communist at one point with the Spartacus rebellion in 1919. So mixed success really for David Lloyd George. The last one, the last of the big three, Woodrow Wilson. Describe his aims. What did he want? He wanted a lasting peace in Europe. He wanted self-determination. That's quite a big phrase. Self-determination. That's the right of people to choose which country they're ruled by. Choose their own government. He wanted the big European powers to stop carving up the world. He did not want revenge. He wasn't interested in revenge. He found it petty and unnecessary. But, then again, the Americans hadn't been as heavily involved in the fighting up until that point. Okay, he wasn't interested in revenge, but it was easy for him to not be interested in revenge, perhaps, or easier because America hadn't been involved in World War I as long as the French and the British. So it wasn't as big a deal for him as an elected politician. What else did he want? He did want some element of blame for Germany. He did see Germany as largely responsible for World War I, so he was all for some level of blame. And he wanted his 14 points. Famously, his 14 points were one of the big things that Wilson pushed for. Included in the 14 points, some of the more salient points. The reduction of armies and weapons. That was one thing he really wanted, one of his 14 points. Freedom of the seas. An end to secret treaties. The formation of a League of Nations. And self-determination for all countries. Okay? They were his aims. Explain. Why did Wilson want these things? First of all, Wilson was an idealist. He meant that he believed he could be the saviour of a world torn apart by war. Slightly egotistical, but perhaps that's what drove him, what motivated him to do what he really believed was right. He failed to understand the significance of French anger. So he was less willing to kind of go along with what what the French were really hankering after, which was just sheer revenge. No fighting had taken place in the USA, so he wasn't sort of it was a little bit further removed from it. Wilson firmly believed that World War I had been caused by secret treaties, so he really wanted an end to this. If you know about the alliance system that was one of the causes of World War I, he really believed that these were responsible for starting the war, so that was a big thing for him. He really wanted to get rid of secret treaties. And he wanted self-determination to promote openness, truth, democracy and trade between countries. He just believed it was a moral wrong for peoples to be ruled by people that they didn't want to rule them. Analysis. Did he get what he wanted? Yes, in a way. The League of Nations was formed with the goal of keeping the peace in Europe. Germany's army and weapons were reduced, as we know. They were weakened. He wanted every country to be reduced, to have their army reduced. Only succeeded in having the German army reduced, but you could class that as a goal on some level. He succeeded in his goal of self-determination for many parts of Europe, particularly self-determination for Alsace and Lorraine, for example. Eupen and Malmedy were returned to Belgium. Parts of Poland were restored, so self-determination was successful on some level. In what ways was he not successful? He did not get freedom of the seas. Remember, the supremacy of the British Navy meant that he didn't get what he wanted in terms of the freedom of the seas. Nor did he really get what he wanted with the League of Nations. The League of Nations ended up being a far more toothless organisation than Woodrow Wilson envisaged. So that's the aims of the big three. We want to quickly do the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. Now this won't take long at all. I'm basically just going to list them. Okay. Perhaps the most important part of the Treaty of Versailles was that it was what was called a diktat. D-I-K-T-A-T, a diktat. It was a dictated peace. This was important because the German people, the German government had no option. They had to accept it. It was a diktat. It was dictated to them. That was one of the most controversial aspects of it. It's not one of the features, one of the terms, but it was a feature of the Treaty of Versailles that it was dictated to people. For the Germans, for the German people, the German government, one of the biggest things was loss of land. Okay. Germany lost about somewhere between 11 and 13% of their land, depending on how you class different regions. I usually say 11%. 11% of German territory was taken away from them. Alsace and Lorraine were given to France. Eupen and Malmedy were given to Belgium. North Schleswig was transferred to Denmark. The Saar coalfield was put under the control of the League of Nations. On the eastern side, Poland was made independent. Port of Danzig was made a free city. Upper Silesia was divided between Germany and Poland. The port of Memel was to be ruled by the League. All gains that Germany had made from the defeat of Russia and the signing of Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, they were all returned. That was all undone. Created the independent states of Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, the Baltic states. The Union of Austria and Germany at what was known as Anschluss, A-N-S-C-H-L-U-S-S. The Union of Austria and Germany was forbidden. Not that that mattered to Adolf Hitler when he overrode that rule, but it was part of the Treaty of Versailles. All of Germany's colonies, overseas colonies, were surrendered to the victorious powers. Loss of land, quite a big deal. I usually advise students to try and memorise at least 3 or 4 of those territories and the countries that they were given to. Okay, it's a massive list that I don't expect everyone to remember all of them, but choose a few. Alsace-Lorraine to France is an obvious one. Eupen and Malmedy to Belgium is easy to remember. North Schleswig to Denmark is quite easy to remember. Danzig becoming a free city is quite easy to remember. So just have a few that are in your head and they're there for examples, okay? The next aspect was war guilt. Germany was forced to accept responsibility for starting the war. It's a huge smack in the face for the German people. Humiliating to have to accept war guilt. If you want to go a little bit further, a little bit more detail, it was known as Clause 231. That was the war guilt clause of the Treaty of Versailles. They were forced to accept it. And again, this is part of the diktat. They were forced to accept response, forced to admit that they caused it. Military restrictions, the third kind of aspect of the Treaty of Versailles, or fourth if you include the fact that it was a diktat, but the third of the terms that were mainly felt by the German people were military restrictions. We've already mentioned these. I'll go through them quickly. Army limited to 100,000 men. Navy limited to 15,000 soldiers. Sailors, beg your pardon. 6 battleships only. No submarines. No air force. Rhineland was demilitarized. So although it still belonged to Germany, no German troops or weapons were allowed to be in that area. And of course this weakened the German army and the German government's capacity to defend itself quite significantly. The last feature of the Treaty of Versailles is very simple. It's reparations, £6.6 billion. And we'll go into the effects on Germany in a minute. Okay. So that's your terms of the Treaty of Versailles. Okay. The impact of the Treaty of Versailles on Germany. Military restrictions. It's quite obvious, this one. Military restrictions meant that Germany was less able to defend itself. It was vulnerable. They were once very proud of their army. This was a big slap in the face for a very militaristic nation to have their army limited. They thought disarmament was unfair, since only they had to reduce their army. Made them angry. Made them resent the other powers of Europe. And they were, of course, they're a Central European country, so they're surrounded on all sides by potential enemies with a smaller army. Loss of land. How did this affect Germany? They lost 72,500 square kilometres. 72,500 square kilometres of territory lost. And 7 million people. This contributed to economic problems, poverty in Germany, as the loss of land meant that a reduction in industry and a reduction in coal from the Saarland, the coal fields in Saar, S-A-R-R. This added to the amount of reparations that the Germans had to pay, meant that their economy was massively affected. And in 1923, it's no surprise, in 1923, just 3 or 4 years after the Treaty of Versailles, Germany suffered from enormous hyperinflation. The value of savings basically went through the floor. So again, this made the German people, the German government, everybody in Germany resent the Treaty of Versailles. They hated it, they found it humiliating, economically, militarily, etc. They also had a quite valid argument that it went against the principle of self-determination, as many people who considered themselves German were no longer German because the territories that they lived in had been transferred to other states. So they had a quite valid reason to argue that it contravened, went against self-determination. I've already mentioned the fact that it was a diktat, upset German people. They were forced to accept it. And again, this contributed to the rise of communism in Germany and the rise of fascism. Two extremist groups, opposed extremist groups. And finally, reparations. How did these affect Germany? Obviously, it had an impact on their ability to create wealth in the country. That then had a knock-on effect with their ability to trade with other countries. And then you got this spiral of downward economic problems. The political fallout from that, as I've said, was the rise of extremism. As people are more prone to poverty, they're more inclined to support extremist groups like communist groups, the Spartakists, and fascist groups like the National Socialists of Hitler. Okay. War guilt was just a big slap in the face. So the German people felt humiliated by having to accept that they were responsible for the war. And we do it for time, just on 20 minutes. So very quickly, the strengths and weaknesses of the Treaty of Versailles, and we're done, okay? Strengths of the Treaty of Versailles. Brought an end to the war in the short term and set up an international organisation, the League of Nations. It did succeed in keeping the peace throughout the 1920s. Didn't succeed beyond that, but through the 1920s it did. Increased the protection for France with the demilitarisation of the Rhineland and the reduction of the German military. It did secure France. You know, that's one of the aims, particularly of Clemenceau, was to secure the safety of France. The treaty helped to repair the economies of Britain and France. By laying all the blame on Germany, the British and the French economies were able to recover following World War I, when they had suffered. And it did reduce the threat from Germany, because they were so beaten down by the terms of the Treaty of Versailles that they weren't any longer a viable potential enemy within Europe. But the weaknesses outweigh the successes. The treaty left Germany with many grievances, such as the reparations, loss of land, weakened the new Weimar government. The new Weimar government, W-E-I-M-A-R. The new government that took over after the Kaiser abdicated was a weak government because they just couldn't really succeed in anything that they wanted to do because they were so impoverished. Germany would be determined to get rid of what it saw as the unfair terms of the treaty, such as the war guilt clause and the denial of the Anschluss and the loss of land. It's basically deferring the problem. As we know now, it deferred the problem for 20 years, and it was eventually Hitler who tore up the Treaty of Versailles and World War II, not as a complete direct consequence of the Treaty of Versailles, but it certainly contributed to Hitler's success and therefore World War II. Some of the terms of the Treaty of Versailles contradicted Wilson's 14 points, such as self-determination in some of those areas that were taken away from Germany. And a final point is that the American government of Woodrow Wilson didn't agree with the terms of the treaty after all. They refused to sign it. They were so upset by how harsh it was towards France that they didn't put their names to it. And this ultimately weakened the nature of the treaty, and it also weakened the League of Nations because America wouldn't be a part of it. Okay? Any questions quickly? Bear in mind your voice will be on YouTube. That's it, Treaty of Versailles done in 24 minutes. Not bad.